how's the study going?
It's not too good, man. I'm really struggling with the foramen of the skull and the passage of the cranial nerves.
I have some free hand. How about I help you out in that?
Yeah, that sounds like that.
Let's go.
Okay, firstly, are you familiar with the cranial bones?
Yeah, I think so. There are two bones that exist in pairs, the temporal and parietal bones. In addition to these, there are four other bones. The frontal bone is here at the front of the cranium, whereas the occipital bone is here at the back of the cranium. Finally, two other cranial bones exist more interiorly. These are the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. All up, these make up the 8 bones of the cranium.
Okay, let's start with the foramen magnum because it's the biggest and the most obvious. Magnum means great or big in Latin, so one way to remember which is the foramen magnum is to look for the biggest hole. So you said you could identify the bones. Which bone is the foramen magnum located in again?
Well, it's at the back of the skull, so I think it's probably within the occipital bone.
Correct. So the reason the foramen magnum is so big is because the brainstem connecting the spinal cord to the brain passes through it. This is also the foramen that the accessory cranial nerve passes through. Just as a side note, you can see here the medulla oblongata and the accessory nerve passing through here, represented by the pipe cleaner and the toilet roll. During this demonstration, I will use green pipe cleaners for the sensory nerves and blue pipe cleaners for cranial nerves that have both sensory and motor functions. And as you can see, red pipe cleaners for motor cranial nerves such as the accessory nerve. Note that the accessory nerve also passes through the jugular foramen.
Oh, I see. It will probably help me to remember that it's also named after my favorite ice cream.
I'm not sure that's quite how the naming order works, but whatever helps you remember. Okay, so now let's look at this opening at the very front of the skull here. Do you have any idea what it's called?
Which foramen are you talking about? There's just lots of little holes.
Yes, you are quite right. This is called the cribriform foramina. These little holes are all perforations in the so-called cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. These holes allow olfactory receptors in the nasal cavity to transmit nerve impulses to the olfactory bulb. If you fracture this holy plate, it can result in CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid, leaking into the nose, causing loss of smell. Now let's move on to the optic foramens. There are 2 optic foramen. Can you guess which structures pass through them? The clue is in the name.
Well, maybe the optic nerve.
Yes! In anatomy, there are a lot of clues in the names, as you can see. The optic foramen is the opening in the sphenoid bone through which the optic nerve passes back into the brain.
Oh, cool. So what's this opening here next to the optic foramen?
That's the superior orbital fissure, located between the lesser and greater wings of the sphenoid bone. The superior orbital fissure has a number of very important structures passing through. These are the superior and inferior divisions of the oculomotor nerve and the abducens nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. Divisions of the ophthalmic vein and sympathetic fibers from the cavernous plexus are also present.
Oh dear, how am I meant to remember all of that?
Well, you could use this helpful mnemonic. Sally is on the other team and she is often scoring. Now, the foramen rotundum can be identified by its circular shape. Just remember that rotundum means round.
Thanks, that is really helpful. I find in this subject it is those little meaning associations that are useful for remembering.
Now this foramen is in the sphenoid bone and is where the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve exits the skull. Similar to the foramen rotundum, you can identify the foramen ovale by its name. Can you guess?
Is it the oval-shaped one?
Correct! Now, the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve passes through the foramen ovale in the sphenoid bone. But remember, don't get it confused with the foramen ovale in the heart.
Oh, okay. I see.
Now this hole here that you can see more posteriorly on the temporal bone is called the internal acoustic meatus. What do you think the little word acoustic suggests about its function?
It might have something to do with hearing or sounds.
Excellent. You are such a smart cookie. The internal acoustic meatus is a short canal that carries the vestibulocochlear cranial nerve that is responsible for our hearing and balance. Additionally to this, it also allows passage of the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve number 7. If it helps, you can think to yourself that the cranial nerve number 7 and 8 meet in the internal acoustic meatus. The passage of these two nerves is implicated when a patient develops benign growths called acoustic neuromas which are known to develop in this canal.
Ouch, that sounds very unpleasant.
Oh yeah, mate, it is.
And what's this hole just below it? Is it in any way related?
That is actually the jugular foramen, whose name you might recognize from the jugular vein. It is formed by the petrous part of the temporal bone and by the occipital bone inferiorly.
Oh, the jugular vein. That's right. I remember that there are two divisions of this vein, the internal and external.
Yes, that is quite correct. However, remember that only the internal jugular branch passes through here, as the external jugular vein does not pass into the skull at all. The jugular foramen not only carries this vein, but also the vagus, the glossopharyngeal, and the accessory cranial nerves. This foramen is often divided into two parts. The anterior and smaller of the two is named the pars nervosa, and contains the cranial nerve 9, while the bigger and more posterior section is named the pars vascularis, and allows passage of the other two nerves.
Oh, that sounds like a lot to remember.
So now we have covered all the cranial nerves and their foramina through the skull, except the last. Number 12!
Oh yes, the hypoglossal cranial nerve, the motor nerve that innervates most of the muscles of the tongue.
Exactly. Its skull foramen is very easy to remember as it innervates most of the intrinsic and extrinsic tongue muscles. In fact, the size of the hypoglossal canal in the occipital bone has been used controversially to figure out a timeline of the evolution of human speech. You can see the foramen here in the occipital bone, found very close to the foramen magnum and the occipital condyles. Alright, so now we've gone through all the 12 cranial nerves and how they pass through the skull. How do you feel?
A lot better now, man. Thanks for that. I'll definitely HD this course now.
You still have a long way to go, you little whippersnapper.